The autumn of 1887 arrived in the High Valley with a peculiar stillness, a held breath before the plunge. The sun, slanting low and golden, offered no real warmth, only the illusion of it. For the other ranchers scattered across the sparse grasslands, this was the season of frantic, familiar work, banking earth against foundations, restuffing chinking between logs with moss and mud, and splitting enough cordwood to feed the insatiable hunger of an iron stove for 5 straight months. It was a rhythm as old as the settlement itself, a liturgy of survival. But on the far edge of the valley, where the creek made a slow bend around a stand of skeletal cottonwoods, Abram was engaged in something else entirely. Something that broke the rhythm. Something that drew long, puzzled stares from anyone who happened to ride the North Trail. He wasn't splitting wood, not yet. He was making mud. But it was a strange mud, a concoction of ingredients that seemed to belong to separate worlds. From the creek bed, he dug pails of rich, grey clay, its texture smooth and heavy in his calloused hands. He worked it with water in a long wooden trough, breaking up the clumps until it was a thick, uniform slurry. Then came the second ingredient, the one that caused the most confusion. From a mound behind his cabin, the collected refuse of a year's worth of fires, he shoveled ash. Not the chunky, charcoal-flecked stuff, but the fine, almost weightless powder that lay at the bottom. He sifted it through a screen, creating a pile of dust as pale and soft as a moth's wing. He mixed this ash into the clay, folding it in with a steady, patient rhythm. The color of the mixture shifted from deep gray to a lighter, softer stone hue. Finally, he added the third element, dried prairie grass, chopped fine, a fibrous binder that would give his creation a hidden strength. He was not patching the chinking. He was preparing to coat the entire outer surface of his log cabin, to cover the honest, sturdy timber with a skin of what looked to everyone else like dirt and dust. Marcus Thorne was the first to stop. He was a man whose opinion carried weight, forged from 2 decades of surviving everything this land could throw at a person. He ran 1,000 head of cattle, and his ranch house was a testament to prosperity, built with milled lumber and glass windows. He reined in his horse, the leather of his saddle creaking in the cold air, and watched Abram for a long moment. Abram didn't pause his work, just continued to trowel the thick, grey plaster onto the logs, starting from the bottom and working his way up. The sound was a soft, rhythmic scrape and press. "Abram," Marcus said, his voice not unkind, but heavy with the certainty of a man who knows the rules. "What in God's name are you doing to that cabin?" Abram finished smoothing a section before looking up. His face was a map of sun and solitude, his eyes a pale, clear blue. "Sealing it," Marcus grunted, swinging a leg over his horse to dismount. He walked closer, touching the still damp surface of the plaster. It was cool and yielded slightly to his touch. "You're smothering it," he stated, as if explaining a law of nature. "You can't do that. Logs have to breathe. You trap the damp inside, you'll have rot in those walls before the spring thaw." Every man in this valley knows that he was right. It was common knowledge, a piece of hard-won wisdom. A log cabin was a living thing in its own way, it swelled and shrank, it settled, it breathed. To encase it in a solid shell was like wrapping a man in oilcloth and expecting him to thrive. Abram simply picked up another trowelful of his mixture. "The logs are seasoned and dry," he said, his voice quiet. "The damp isn't in the wood. It's in the air. The wind brings it. The wind is the thief, Marcus. It doesn't just steal warmth. It forces its way in with the cold and the moisture." Marcus shook his head, a gesture of both pity and frustration. "That's what chinking is for. You patch the gaps. You don't entomb the whole structure. This is folly. It'll crack and fall off in the first hard freeze, and you'll have wasted the last good weeks of weather on this mud pie." Abram looked at the vast, empty sky, then back at his work. "We'll see when the judge arrives," he said. Marcus, knowing Abram meant the winter, simply mounted his horse. "Don't say I didn't warn you, old man." The story of Abram's mud pie, as Marcus had called it, traveled faster than a prairie fire. In the small general store that served as the valley's social hub, it became a source of grim amusement. Finn, a young ranch hand with a loud laugh and an opinion on everything, held court by the pot-bellied stove. Heard about old Abram, he asked the room at large, a grin already splitting his face. He's decided his cabin ain't a cabin no more. It's a rock. Building himself a tomb out there on the creek, a few of the men chuckled. They were all tired, their muscles aching from the same seasonal preparations Abram had forsaken. The idea of his strange, pointless labor was a welcome distraction. My pa told me he saw him sifting ashes like a baker sifts flour, another man added, leaning back in his chair. Ashes? What's next? He gonna try to make bread out of it too. The laughter grew louder. It wasn't entirely cruel, it was the laughter of men who lived by a strict set of rules dictated by a harsh environment. Deviating from those rules was not just eccentric, it was dangerous. It courted failure, and in this place, failure could be fatal. When Abram himself entered the store, a hush fell over the group. He nodded quietly, his grocery list in his hand. He could feel their eyes on him, could feel the shape of their jokes hanging in the air. As Mr. Henderson, the storekeeper, weighed out his flour and beans, Finn couldn't resist one last jibe. Building it up tight, are you, Abram? He called out. Hoping to keep the ghosts in or keep them out? Abram didn't turn around. He paid for his goods, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He gathered his sacks and, without a word, walked back out into the cold sunlight. The laughter resumed before the door had even swung shut. He didn't let it show on his face, but each laugh was a small stone striking him. They saw an old fool making a fatal mistake. They saw a man alone, disconnected from the collective wisdom that kept them all alive. They didn't see the memory of his father, a stonemason from the old country, explaining the principle of lime mortar. They didn't see the logic, only the strangeness. The long walk home was quieter than usual, the landscape more vast and indifferent. That night, the temperature dropped sharply. A skin of ice formed over the water bucket by the door. Inside, Abram sat by his stove, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The first two walls of the cabin were done, covered in the smooth, grey plaster that was now slowly curing in the dry air. The other two walls were still bare logs, the dark lines of chinking a stark contrast. He could already feel the difference. On the plastered side of the room, the air felt still, the cold held at bay. On the other, a familiar, faint draft whispered from the seams, a cold breath that was always there, no matter how much moss you packed into the gaps. He ran a hand over the empty rocking chair beside him. It had been Elspeth's. She had been gone for 3 winters now, but the silence she left behind was a presence in itself. He remembered her watching him work, her quiet confidence a bulwark against his own doubts. Your father knew things they've forgotten here, she had told him once, years ago, when he'd built their first small smokehouse using similar methods. This is a new country. People are in a hurry. They build fast, not forever. He was not in a hurry anymore. He had only time. But the mockery stung, not because it hurt his pride, but because it amplified his solitude. Was he a fool? Was he chasing the ghost of his father's words down a path to ruin? He thought of Marcus Thorne's warning. Rot. The word had a sickening weight to it. What if he had sealed the moisture in? What if, come spring, the logs beneath his careful plaster were soft and crumbling? He would have destroyed his only shelter with his own 2 hands. For a moment, a profound and chilling doubt washed over him. He was one man against the collected experience of the entire valley. He was trusting a memory from a different land, a different climate, against the lived reality of this place. The wind picked up outside, a low moan that rattled the single glass pane in his window. It was a sound he knew well, the sound of heat being pulled from his home, stitch by stitch. He looked at the candle on the table. Its flame trembled, dancing with the drafts he couldn't even feel. That little flame was the real measure of his house. And right now, it was telling him that his house was a sieve. He stood up, his resolve hardening again. He would trust the principle. He would trust his hands. He would finish the job. A week later, with the last wall plastered and the grey shell of his cabin complete, another visitor arrived. This was not a neighbor. It was Mr. Davies from the Territorial Land Office, a man who dealt in paper and regulations, not mud and logs. He was making his annual rounds to verify that homesteaders were making the required improvements to their claims. He dismounted, his town clothes looking flimsy and out of place against the rugged landscape. His eye scanned Abram's cabin with a look of deep skepticism. "Mr. Abram," he began, foregoing any pleasantries, "I'm here to inspect your improvements for the year. My records state you intended to build a new barn, had to see to the house first," Abram said simply. Davies walked the perimeter of the cabin, tapping the hard plaster with a gloved knuckle. It made a solid, stony sound. "What is this?" he asked, his tone laced with official disapproval. "I've never seen a log structure coated in cement. It's a mix of clay and ash," Abram explained. To seal it from the wind, Davies took out a small notebook and made a note. "Unorthodox," he said, the word hanging in the air like a verdict. "The Homestead Act requires permanent, durable improvements using established and sound building practices. This is an experiment." An unproven 1 inch, he looked from the strange, grey cabin to the vast, unforgiving mountains that ringed the valley. "The government has an interest in seeing these claims succeed, Abram. We invest in proven methods. We are not in the business of funding novelties. If this coating fails, if it cracks, traps moisture, and ruins the structural integrity of the dwelling, it will not be considered a valid improvement." The threat was unspoken but clear. A failed claim could be revoked. His title to this piece of land, the one he had worked for a decade, depended on him satisfying a bureaucrat who thought his life's work was a foolish novelty. "It will hold," Abram said, his voice quiet but firm. Davies just gave a thin, unconvinced smile. "For your sake, I hope so. I'll make a note of its unusual nature in my report. We will revisit the matter in the spring." Good day. He rode off, leaving Abram standing before his home, which now felt less like a sanctuary and more like a gamble. The stakes had been raised. It was no longer just about comfort, or even survival. It was about everything he had. The valley might mock him, but the government could erase him. The principle Abram was staking his entire life on was one the modern world had largely forgotten, a secret hidden in plain sight. It wasn't about insulation in the way we think of it now, as a thick barrier to stop the transfer of cold. It was about something far more simple and profound, the power of still air. You see, the great enemy in a northern winter isn't the ambient temperature outside. It's the wind. The wind is a relentless thief, an invisible river that flows over and through a house, carrying its precious warmth away. A log cabin, for all its romantic sturdiness, is a battlefield of tiny gaps. The spaces between the logs, around the window frames, under the door, each one is a breach in the defenses. The traditional solution, chinking, was like plugging 1,000 tiny holes in a dike while a hurricane raged. It was a constant, losing battle. What Abram was doing was different. He wasn't just plugging the holes. He was changing the very nature of the barrier. He was creating a single, monolithic skin over the entire structure. The plaster, a composite material born of ancient knowledge, was the key. The clay provided the body, the mass. The dried grass acted as a fibrous reinforcement, much like modern rebar in concrete, preventing large cracks from forming as the structure settled. But the secret ingredient, the one they laughed at, was the ash. Wood ash, when combined with the moisture in the clay, undergoes a slow chemical reaction. It acts as a pozzolan, creating calcium silicate hydrates. In simpler terms, it turned the clay from simple dried mud into a kind of primitive, breathable cement. It made the plaster harder, more durable, and significantly more resistant to water. His goal was to create a vessel. Think of a house not as a fortress, but as a bowl. You wish to keep a precious commodity, warmth, inside that bowl. A log cabin is a bowl made of woven reeds. You can see the shape, but it cannot hold water. Abram was lining that woven bowl with a seamless layer of waterproof clay. He was making it whole. The result he sought was a pocket of truly still air, a calm island in the middle of a raging atmospheric sea. If he succeeded, the heat from his small stove wouldn't be stolen the moment it was created. It would stay. It would accumulate. And the proof, when the time came, wouldn't require a government inspector or a panel of experts. It would be demonstrated by the quiet flicker of a single candle flame and the untroubled sleep of a feather. The first snows came in early November, a light dusting that melted by noon. But it was a warning. The grey plaster on Abram's cabin had fully cured, hardening into a shell that felt like soft stone to the touch. It was not beautiful. It gave the cabin a somber, monolithic look, like a building half-carved from the earth. The valley looked upon it with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity, waiting for the first real freeze to shatter the old man's folly. Abram paid them no mind. He spent his days securing his livestock and splitting the last of his wood, his movements calm and efficient. He knew what was coming. The old-timers could feel it in their bones, a particular ache that foretold a winter of unusual cruelty. The sky stayed a hard, brilliant blue for 2 weeks, but the air had a crystalline edge to it, so cold it hurt to breathe too deeply. Then, one afternoon, the sky began to change. The blue faded to a milky white, and a strange, yellowish light suffused the landscape, making everything look flat and unreal. The wind died completely. The silence was absolute, unnatural. This was the final sign. The great storm, the true judge, was gathering its strength. By nightfall, the first flakes began to drift down, not in a flurry, but slowly, vertically, like ash from a distant fire. Abram went inside. He lit his stove, the fire catching quickly in the still air. He ate his supper of beans and salted pork, the familiar routine a comfort against the impending chaos. He checked the seams of his window one last time. He did not need to stuff them with rags this year. He sat in his chair, not Elspeth's, and waited. The snow fell faster. The world outside his window dissolved into a swirling whiteness. And then, the wind came. It started as a low moan and rose to a piercing shriek, a physical force that slammed into the little cabin. This was the moment of truth. This was the test that would either vindicate him or leave him ruined and freezing in a cracked shell of his own making. And you who are watching might think the proof is in the storm, but the real proof, the numbers, and the undeniable evidence, is coming. Stay with us, and you will see just how much difference a little ash and clay can make. Inside Abram's cabin, the defining feature was not warmth, but silence. The blizzard raged, a physical assault of wind and ice that should have been a deafening roar. In any other cabin in the valley, it would have been a symphony of shrieks and whistles, the sound of 1,000 tiny breaches being violated by the storm. But here, the fury was muted, a deep, low rumble like a distant ocean. The walls did not transmit the sound, they absorbed it. The monolithic skin of ash and clay was not just a barrier to air, but to noise as well. Abram stoked the fire, adding a single, seasoned log. The stove was barely working, its damper turned almost completely shut. He walked over to the small table where a candle burned. The flame stood tall and perfectly straight, its golden teardrop barely quivering. It was a silent, eloquent testament to the stillness of the air. He then took a small, downy feather from a jar on the mantelpiece. He held it up to the place where the rough-hewn window frame met the plastered logs, the spot that had always been his worst enemy. In previous winters, a feather held here would have danced and skittered violently. Tonight, it hung from his fingers, limp and motionless. Not a whisper of air disturbed it. Finally, he checked the thermometer hanging on the wall farthest from the stove. It read 65 degrees. Outside, the temperature was plummeting past zero, with a wind chill that was something out of a nightmare. 65 degrees. Maintained by a fire that was little more than an idle glow. Meanwhile, for miles to the east, Marcus Thorne was losing his battle. His fine, milled lumber house was a sieve of a different kind. The wind, a razor-fine infiltrator, found its way through the siding, around the elegant glass windows, and up through the floorboards. His family was huddled in the main room, wrapped in every blanket they owned. The stove roared, consuming wood at an alarming rate, its metal sides glowing a dull red, yet the heat it produced was snatched away instantly. The room was a landscape of contradictory sensations, scorching heat a foot from the stove, and a bone-chilling cold 10 feet away. Marcus could see his breath. Over at Finn's much smaller, rougher cabin, the situation was worse. A thick layer of frost had formed on the inside of his window panes, and a small drift of fine snow was growing on the floor beneath the door. The battle was already lost, now it was just a matter of enduring. For 2 days and 2 nights, the world ceased to exist. There was only the white rage of the storm and the small pockets of humanity fighting to survive within it. On the 3rd morning, the wind began to subside. The shrieking dropped to a moan, and then to a whisper. By noon, there was a fragile, exhausted silence. The snow had stopped. A weak, grey light filtered through the clouds. The valley was unrecognizable, a sea of white, with only the vague shapes of rooftops and the tops of the tallest trees breaking the surface. Abram opened his door, a task that required considerable effort against a 3-foot drift. The cold that met him was shocking, a clean, brutal force. But the air was still. He spent the next hour digging a path to his woodshed and his small barn, checking on his horse and 2 milk cows. They were cold but alive, sheltered in their sturdy lean-to. As he was finishing, he saw a figure moving slowly and painfully across the sea of white, coming from the direction of the Thorn Ranch. The figure was bundled beyond recognition, stumbling in the deep snow, clearly exhausted. Abram watched, his hand on his axe handle, until the figure drew closer. It was Marcus Thorn. His face was gaunt, his beard caked with ice. He collapsed against the cabin wall, breathing in ragged gasps. Abram helped him inside, into the impossible, steady warmth. Marcus looked around the room, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked at the quiet stove, the still candle flame on the table, the lack of any frost on the window. He finally looked at Abram. His voice, when it came, was a raw croak. "My youngest. Sarah. She has a fever. We couldn't keep the room warm. The fire, it just couldn't keep up. We burned through half our woodpile in 2 days." He gestured vaguely at the serene interior of Abram's cabin. How? It was the same question he had asked weeks ago, but this time it was not a challenge. It was a plea. "The wind is the thief," Abram said again, softly. He didn't offer any other explanation. He didn't need to. The proof was all around them. He handed Marcus a tin mug of hot coffee. The vindication was not in words. It was in the simple, life-giving fact of a warm, quiet room in the heart of a frozen world. The Great Blizzard of '87 became a benchmark in the valley's history, a new before and after by which time was measured. Stories trickled out as people dug their way free. Stories of lost livestock, of frostbite, of families who had survived by tearing up floorboards to feed their fires. Finn had lost 2 of his best cows, found frozen solid in a drift not 50 yards from his barn. But the most persistent story, the one that grew into a local legend, was about the old man in the mud cabin. It was told how Marcus Thorn, the most respected rancher in the valley, had gone to Abram for help and had been met not with scorn, but with a quiet, steady warmth that defied the laws of nature as they knew them. A few weeks later, when the trails were passable again, Thorn rode over to Abram's place. He didn't bring thanks or apologies. He brought a notepad and a pencil. He sat at Abram's table for 2 hours, asking questions. He didn't ask about theories, he asked about process. How deep to dig for the right clay? How fine to sift the ash? What was the right amount of grass to add? Abram answered each question with the simple, practical language of a craftsman. He explained that the plaster had to be applied in a single, continuous layer, that it had to be thick enough to have integrity but not so thick that it would slump under its own weight. He explained that the curing was the most important part, that it had to dry slowly, away from direct sun, to prevent cracking. By the time spring arrived, a change began to sweep through the valley. That summer, Marcus Thorn's hired hands were seen not building a new barn, but digging clay from the creek bed behind his property. By late autumn, his fine milled house was wearing a new, dull grey skin. Finn, humbled and poorer, came by one afternoon, hat in hand, and asked Abram if he might spare a bit of advice. The mockery was gone, replaced by a grudging, then a genuine, respect. Abram never sought recognition. He had done it for himself, to honor a memory and to survive. But in doing so, he had given the entire community a new lease on life. He had reminded them that sometimes the most powerful innovations are not new inventions, but rediscovered truths. The knowledge spread, from one rancher to another, becoming part of the valley's own common wisdom. Abram's cabin was no longer a mud pie or a tomb. It was a lesson, written in clay and ash upon the landscape, a quiet monument to the simple, profound idea that the best way to fight a storm is to first create a place of perfect calm. For those of you who have faced your own storms, perhaps you understand. True strength isn't always about pushing back, sometimes it's about creating a seal so perfect that the storm doesn't even know you're there. If this story of forgotten wisdom resonates with you, consider subscribing for more tales of practical history. And please, hit the like button, it helps these old truths find a new audience. Let us know in the comments if you've ever seen a technique like this, or have a story of old knowledge proving its worth. The events depicted in this story are a fictionalized reconstruction intended to illustrate historical building principles. Consult with professional engineers and builders before attempting any construction methods.